Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Poetry Book Society Instagram Book Club live event where we're going to be chatting to two fantastic poets tonight, Tiffany Atkinson and Holly Pester. Patricia's here with me as well. She's currently just playing with a couple of toys on the floor, but she'll be no doubt joining us in a couple of minutes, and so you can say hello to her as well. I know it's been a little bit of a while, hasn't it? It's been a while since we have done one of these live events, and it's been a while since we've had one of these Instagram live book clubs. But welcome everyone to today's Instagram live book club, where, as I say, we're going to be talking about two fantastic collections of poetry: Tiffany Atkinson's Lumen and Holly Pester's Comic Timing, published by two of our most exciting and important independent poetry presses, Blood Axe and Grantor Poetry. Tiffany Atkinson's collection Lumen was a Poetry Book Society recommendation for spring 2021, and Holly Pester's Comic Timing was a PBS wildcard choice for spring 2021 as well. So thank you so much to everyone for coming and joining us. Patricia is here at my feet as we speak, gazing longingly at her stuffed elephant, which she enjoys doing unmentionable things to, which I can't possibly reveal on camera. And so, if you're new to these events, I'm Andrew McMillan. I'm one of the selectors for the Poetry Book Society. I have that honour that I get to read all the books that come out every quarter, and alongside Sarah Howe, the wonderful Sarah Howe, we get to choose which books we want to kind of celebrate and push forward. And today we're talking about two books from the spring collection, which was the last selection that I did alongside the great Sinead Morrissey. So Sinead Morrissey also had a hand in choosing these collections, and of course Anthony Anaxagora as well, who's been a long-time guest and friend of these Instagram live book clubs, also instrumental in choosing Holly Pester's collection for us at the PBS as well. And so the Poetry Book Society, for those of us that don't know, is a seasonal book club that celebrates and shows the very best in contemporary poetry. And we're heading into summer now. I've got some plants here, so you know that we're heading in to summer, and that means that the Poetry Book Society summer quarter choices have just been made. And so if you join the Poetry Book Society now, then you will start with their summer mailing, which goes out in May. And choice members, if you join as a choice member, you'll get Kazim Ali's The Voice of Sheila Chandra, published by another wonderful indie press, Platypus Press, and that was the summer choice. If you are a complete member, which costs a little more but means that you get more collections, you'll get both the choice, Kazim Ali, but you'll also get Rebecca Perry, Kayo Chingonyi, Nushat Bakari, Luke Kennard and Eduardo Morga. So an incredible kind of array and spread of what's happening in contemporary poetry at the minute. All new members get a free copy of the latest magazine, which is where myself and Sarah kind of write a bit about the collections and why we've chosen them, and the poets themselves write a bit about what went into the making of the collections as well. And you get a £10 book voucher and 25% off all the books online at poetrybooks.co.uk. So check out poetrybooks.co.uk if you want to know more about the Poetry Book Society, and sign up if you're not already a member. Patricia, of course, is a member. She's got a dog's membership, which is something I've just made up, so don't email them asking what that is. And so, as I say, tonight we're going to hear from two fantastic poets for about 25 minutes each. I'm going to ask some questions. We're going to hear some poems from both of them, but there's also going to be a chance for you to ask questions as well. And so if I put my glasses on that are just at the side of me here, I can then see the comments that you write at the bottom. So do say hello, do check in, do comment as we're going along, and then do ask questions of the poets as well. That's always invited, and if we get time, I can put those questions to the poets as we're going through. And so my first guest tonight is the wonderful Tiffany Atkinson and her brilliant new collection Lumen, which is just out from Blood Axe Books and is a Poetry Book Society recommendation for spring 2021. And so by the magic of technology, I'm now going to invite Tiffany to join us. Sip of tea while that happens. Hello.
Hello. Hi. How are you? It's
I'm very good,
magic.
thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
excellent
good.
to have you here. Thanks so much for doing this. And I've got so much that I want to talk about and ask with this just astonishing collection. But I wonder, before we get into any of that, if you want to read us a poem.
Sure. Yeah, I thought I'd read the poem that has the title name word lumen in it, which comes from a medical residency, which is a sequence. The first part of the book is a sequence based around that. And lumen, I think everyone knows lumen is a unit of light. You know, light bulbs have so many lumens, etc. But I didn't know that it has a medical usage, which I did discover in the hospital. So this is the poem where that word arises. It's called Clean Windows. Sean, the new department manager, spends all the petty cash on window cleaners for these huge panes 6 floors up. They all have their foibles, says Pinky, shucking a glove with a smack. We're in the main ward, high and formal as an Oxbridge hall. A trolley turns a corner somewhere deep, and then, as if the hospital swings downwind and hangs on its anchor, calm, rolls up the jinxy stairwells to this floor, where, through the hand-rinsed glass, we watch a white van climb out of the valley to the new world. What's a word for how the light, this cold May afternoon, ruffles the blue-pleated curtain behind Mr. Mooney, reaching for his tumbler like a man underwater? I have lumen biroed on my hand because the nurse who used it scuttled off before I got to ask. What's a lumen, Pinky? Just an opening, she says.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And what a brilliant introduction to this collection. I wanted to dive in, and I was going to begin by asking something about the language that you've been using in this collection. But because you mentioned that residency and you write a bit about it in the magazine as well, I just wondered if you wanted to just say a little bit more for the audience about how that residency had come about, or what that entailed for you.
Yeah, it was quite brief. The residency is quite a grandiose term. Basically, around in a local hospital in Wales, so small rural hospital, long before COVID and any of our kind of current concerns. But it was an opportunity for writers to just sort of sit around in different places. So I always wanted to go and sit in the hospital, which is a slightly odd thing to do, but anyway, that's what I did. But at the time I was working I had a critical project about representations of pain and language, and how there's a kind of a critical convention that it's very difficult that physical pain resists language, and this is a problem for health workers, but also for like Amnesty and organisations like that. So I kind of went in with this kind of fairly academic idea, but of course, you know, anything where you actually go and put yourself in a real situation, all of that pretty quickly went out the window. So in the end, it was kind of collecting stories, fragments, people's experiences, and so on, and assembling. I say sequence again, grandiose term for kind of constellation of related poems. Yeah, so that's where that one came from.
I think it's so striking, though, Tiffany, that you say there about this idea of something that is often beyond language itself. And I think one of the things that so excited me about this book was that it's in search, and it's finding that language for something which is kind of so often always beyond us. And it seems to me that in this book, you're kind of pulling from both a medical phraseology, but also the poetic image. And somehow those two things together, or those two things in conversation, is how you begin to find that new linguistic register to describe pain and to describe those kind of spaces. And I just wonder what it was like, kind of as a process, kind of just finding that language, as you say, for that thing that is beyond language oftentimes, kind of as a poet, drawing on that medical phraseology and then bringing in the poetic image as well. Kind of how you went about that project, or kind of how you began to find your way into that new linguistic kind of framework, or that new language for it.
That's a difficult question. Well, firstly, a lot of the medical literature is, you know, if you read it without understanding it, you know, it's very suggestive, rich language anyway. So lumen is a good example. the actual word. But also what I discovered is that people are actually extremely eloquent and articulate about their experiences. They just don't use kind of conventional, denotative language, but they're aware of describing and expressing not just pain, but all kinds of, experiences at the edge of language. And it's the kind of friction between those, between what can be said and perhaps adjacent things. So a lot of the images were notes that I'd made that then, when they're kind of laid adjacent to other bits of writing, seem to acquire in the gap between a kind of resonance. But I don't know that I could have set out to sort of do that. Do you know what I mean? It's a kind of, I don't know. Sorry, it's a hard question to answer. But I think a lot of those poems were written by laying disparate elements against each other, and seeing what happens in between, but also listening to people and how articulate they were, albeit not in a now I am going to tell you about my experience of surgery kind of way. So that was quite instructive.
Absolutely. And one of the kind of phrases, or one of the images that really stuck out to me towards the beginning of the collection is the moment where there's the house and its pain is kind of hung like washing, like laundry in the house. And it's that kind of, it's that, as you say, that kind of friction or that tension between the kind of everyday language of something and a kind of medicalized kind of language for something, isn't it? And how those two things rub up against each other, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that interests me too. I mean, I have no medical experience, evidently, but I've been a patient, I'm a body, and that experience of kind of coming up against diagnostic language and feeling kind of slightly estranged by that, which I think a lot of us do. And yeah, that poem actually came about because a doctor, a consultant, now a very senior consultant, was telling me a story about when he was a trainee, I think, or he was junior doctor or something like that, not very experienced, and he was having to deal with a patient with chronic pain, and her entire family had become sucked into the vortex of managing this pain, and all of them wanted basically opiates and more opiates, and he was having to resist that kind of solution, as it seemed, and he couldn't describe it either, and he kept saying, oh, it was awful, it was like, and I was like, well, what was it like? He said, oh, it was just like, and he couldn't finish that. So I kind of thought, well, that's an interesting proposition, that might be a job for writing, for poetry, to imagine some of those things. Hence, pain was like laundry, and it was hanging from every edge or something like that, and they're very domestic, familiar images in that poem as well.
And in that sense, I guess, just as you're describing that, like by using poetry to find that new language or that new way of articulating something, it also then has a use, doesn't it, beyond itself, that it then hopefully for medical professionals or for patients, as you say, that it's about maybe finding those new spaces for them to be able to express themselves, or also, as you said, because they're already so articulate, kind of championing and sort of celebrating that everyday language as well.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. However, I mean, the one thing I did learn from that hospital residency was that, by and large, I was considered entirely superfluous and pointless. And it's a lovely idea. Oh, yes, it would be lovely, wouldn't it, if we could sit down and spend time thinking of creative ways. But I don't think actual medical professionals have much time, to be fair, especially now. So yeah, but I do wonder about perhaps spaces not directly in the hospital where these encounters can take place. I mean, the other thing that I felt very keenly at the time, and this was it's 4 years ago now, but was that there was no we almost didn't speak the same language. There was no communication between what I represented, which was the arts, and science and medicine, and we were both mutually baffled and rather embarrassed at our kind of inability to talk the same language. So I do sometimes wonder if there aren't spaces outside of medical emergency, where those conversations, awkward though they must be, could happen.
Absolutely. And I think it's so interesting, Tiffany. One of the things you said in an earlier answer was this notion of, you've not worked in, you don't have a kind of medical background, but you've been a patient.
No.
Well,
Oh, we've got a lag there. I missed that.
Come back for you, Tiffany?
Yes, I'm back now. I can hear you now.
Fabulous.
Sorry.
Excellent. Sorry about that. No. So
No,
it's just
probably Norwich. Norwich.
um so fascinating because you mentioned that notion of you said I've not got that medical background, but I've been a patient and I've got a body. And so
Yeah.
many of these poems, as we kind of move through the collection, they seem to me to be about how the kind of body or the self is placed into these different situations. So we get that yoga session, or we get the creative writing class. And I wondered if part of it is within those poems, kind of putting the body, as you say, kind of into those spaces, and then seeing kind of how does it function in those spaces, kind of what happens to it, the body within those different locations or kind of circumstances somehow.
Yeah, I wasn't conscious of doing that, but funnily enough, having been sort of in a creative teaching today poetry and talking about how at least, well, as far as we know, for the foreseeable future, we are going to be in bodies, and it is a useful starting point. You can always kind of orientate yourself in that way, even if that experience is one of disorientation. So I do find that it's a useful kind of anchor for experiences. And it's also, I suppose, because it's something that we have by and large in common. I know we all experience bodies differently and so forth, but it is quite a point of connection. So when patients were talking to me about trying to describe a particular kind of pain, it was, what I was trying to do was sort of imagine that in my body. It wasn't in my head. I was trying to do it in my body. So I think that it can be quite a useful grounding. Yeah, although I hadn't thought about that before. I hadn't set out to do that. But yeah, thank you.
That's all right.
It sounds like I intended that all along.
And it strikes me as well, I think, and people that have read the collection already will know this, and people that are going to kind of read it after our chat will come to learn this. But one of the kind of, I think, things about this collection that is so great is just the brilliance of image that we get in it. Like, it just kind of pinpoint and kind of exciting and so fresh in terms of the imagistic world that it's able to conjure up in these poems. And I was wondering, as a poet, and there are poets kind of that come and listen to these conversations, do poems often, this is a hard question to answer, so I'm sorry in advance, do poems often begin for you in the image, or do they begin for you kind of in the language, or is it not possible to separate that? Like, I just wondered, some of these images are so on point and so brilliant. I wondered if they'd begun in the image and opened out, or does the image just kind of occur as the kind of poem is being drafted, I guess, as it's being constructed?
Gosh, it is a good question. Could you answer that about your own poems? It's
No.
quite hard. No. When did you get? I think a lot of the for the medical sequence, a lot of the images came out of just sitting, a lot of very boring hours where nothing was happening. And what I was doing was just observing everything around. So a lot of that material came from that. But in other examples, I don't know. I think my experience of where poems begin is very often it feels like a little it's like a little spark or a little crystal or something. It's like a little jolt of energy, isn't it? And it doesn't necessarily, it's not very articulate. It could be an image. Sometimes it's an image, or it's a phrase, or it's just a rhythm or something. And my experience of that is that you just have to wait for other things to kind of be attracted to it, almost like sort of iron filings or something, and that it's quite a crystalline. It's like growing a crystal. That's what it feels like to me. And that often, yes, I suppose it quite often is an image that begins that. Yeah, but at no point am I kind of conscious of thinking, now it's time to look at that thing and describe it in terms of something else. I mean, that just doesn't happen in that mechanical way. So do you know, I'm sorry to be so inarticulate. I don't really know how that...
No, I think it's a hard question, but you've answered it really well. I love that image of the kind of iron filings being attracted to it. I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about it. So almost a kind of first draft or an early draft of a poem, lifting the ideas into something, maybe.
yeah, sort of intensifying or something. And also, I mean, you know, as those filings kind of cluster, you start to see a shape of some sort, and that's always been my experience. I've never been able to sort of envisage ahead what, you know, oh, it's going to be this, or it's going to be this. Always found that a very difficult way to write. Yeah, it feels more like kind of accumulating, yeah, piling things together.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, though. Like that, I think that's articulated incredibly well. And if people do have questions that they want to ask Tiffany, do kind of put those into the chat box, and I can put those to Tiffany. I was just thinking, one of the things I guess that we've kind of talked about a bit already. You mentioned at the start, but something that you also mentioned in the write-up that you've done of the collection in the PBS magazine is this notion of the kind of unreliability of language. And I found that such an interesting concept as well, because we often think of poets having to be, when we first start out with poets, that we must be very certain, and we must kind of know, I wandered lonely as a cloud, I'm very definite about things. And I just wondered if kind of what for you that freedom in, maybe that, is there an inherent freedom in kind of the unreliability of language, maybe?
Sorry, just if you can hear dog noise.
Yes.
I'm going to try to see if I can show you my Otto, because he might appear. Hello, Otto.
Excellent. There we go.
There we go. Since it was going to be the dog special. Yeah. Sorry, what was the question? I've completely.
That's all right. So just thinking about this notion of like the unreliability. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good point, isn't it? Because I think at the beginning, yeah, you're right. You feel that, you know, in order to be, you know, what is a poet if not somebody who has absolute precision and control of language? And yet, the more I suppose the more I enjoy reading poetry, the more I discovered that what I actually liked was the poetry that really pushes up against the edge of what it's possible to say. So I think you can have both. You can have a certain amount of kind of precision and clarity, but point at where it runs out somehow. I think I feel that most things I write do that. That there's a point where you're just kind of your poem is just sort of pointing and saying that thing over there, you know, that thing, but not ever necessarily grasping it. But I think that's powerful in its own way. It's a different kind of experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I find it a pleasure, but I had to learn to find it a pleasure.
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking just as you were talking then that I think there's a confidence in that, and it's something that perhaps we have to grow into as poets, isn't it? That we don't have to kind of have it we don't have to grab it and we don't have to grasp it. That actually, as you say, it might be a kind of gesture towards something, or it might be just a kind of, it might be over there, but the poem doesn't necessarily have to get there somehow, I guess.
Yeah, maybe something like that. And also I think you have to learn to enjoy it when you read it. And I remember that distinctly, learning to enjoy that reader and not thinking, oh my God, it means I'm really thick, I can't understand this, everyone else would get it, but somehow enjoying being ever so slightly adrift in a controlled environment or something like that, you know. But I had to learn, because it's not normal, it's not the natural disposition towards reading, is it? You feel like you read in order to get something, to master it. But the older, maybe it's just to do with being old, the older I get, the more I enjoy that experience.
I just think that's so interesting, though, that notion of, as you say, that the way that we change as readers, and then the way that then I guess that becomes a part of how we want to write, doesn't it? Or that impacts our own practice. And I guess, like, do you find, because, you know, I know you teach creative writing, do you find students that are kind of still trying to pull themselves towards that kind of definite certainty as they kind of start out in their poetic careers, that they're trying to maybe grasp onto the thing rather than have that confidence to kind of let it slightly float away? Or be it see within that constant, as you described it there, I think, really well.
Yeah, both, I think, and it depends on the sort of subject, doesn't it? Because I think, you know, particularly, I don't want to generalize too much, but you know, when I was younger, when we are younger, we're very often trying to establish something. You know, clarity is a big deal in all areas of one's life, isn't it? And part of the writing is to do with expressing that or identifying that. So yes, there is an element of that, but I think most, I mean, my experience of students is that they're just very omnivorous and want to try all kinds of different things, and often come up with juxtapositions of techniques that you just think, oh crikey, how come no one's ever done that before? The only thing that we all have the problem sometimes of being kind of needlessly opaque. So it's whatever the reader wants it to be. I'm not sure that's ever a good, that usually means that you don't really know yourself, and we've all done that, right? I remember to smuggle one of those through, but yeah, at the moment I'm really interested in both aspects of beginner writers, if we can call reasonably beginner writers, the combination of a kind of desire for precision and the naming of things, the naming of experiences and issues around identity and so forth, but also a kind of curiosity about things that are really hard to deal with. So for example, climate change, ecological catastrophe, again, something that we're really struggling to find a language for, and which nearly always involves a certain amount of pointing. So yeah, I feel like we're all kind of negotiating between those poles a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
Can I hear Patricia snoring?
She can hear. It's not, but don't take it personally, Tiffany. She's had a long day. Where is she? There she is.
No, no. I know that a sleeping dog is a tribute indeed. Yeah.
She's just so relaxed by the conversation. That's all it is. And do people jump in if you've got a question that you'd like me to put to Tiffany? Because otherwise, I can just keep asking my questions all evening, really. I mean, in the final poem of the collection, Eggshell, which is just stunning, and I mean, I write about it in the PBS brochure as well. But it's got this beautiful phrase: "Each body's quiet business." And I think it's just such a gorgeous phrase, because it seemed to me like I like to find these moments in collections that seem to not explain or kind of underpin something, but seem to kind of echo back through the collection. And it seemed just in that notion of each body's quiet business that a lot of these poems were in their addressing of that kind of medical space and the language of pain and things like that, kind of bodies or people that might otherwise not get written about, or these moments that might otherwise kind of pass us by. And there just seemed a really kind of beautiful moment in each body's quiet business, and that these poems were maybe at work to try and articulate whatever that quiet business was, be it love or embarrassment or art or pain. That seemed like one of the kind of things that might draw the collection together, I guess.
Oh wow! Well, thank you, and thank you for saying that about that poem, because I've never read that one aloud, because I don't know why I'm a bit kind of shy about it. I think because the painter in it is in fact the person who painted my house and said, "Oh, show me the poem." Show me the poem. This is like 2 years ago, and I still haven't shown him the poem because I'm like, oh, I don't know, that thing where you think, oh, what have I done? You think no one's ever going to read things, and then they're in a book, and you're like, oh, it didn't occur to me that real people read these things, so thank you for saying that, and yes, I mean, I suppose I am interested in the quiet business of the not just the the extravagant and loud business of bodies, but the things that are intimate and quite often unspoken. I mean, I think in that poem describes a scenario where nobody speaks. There's the radio on, I think, isn't there? There's a voice coming up the stairs, but there's no proper conversation. It's all unspoken.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a dog in it as well.
And there's a dog in it, so what more could we want?
I think.
And I guess
snoring dog, yeah.
Just bouncing off that point that you just made, there's a question that came in, which I guess is about sort of someone wondering how we make peace with the fact, I guess, as poets, that we might kind of, as you say, kind of write something about someone, or we might be kind of those poems that were kind of based within that kind of time that you'd spent in the hospital and things like that. How much do we want those to resonate with the people they're about, or do we see them as kind of something separate, that we kind of took inspiration from something and then I guess that they become something separate? That's what I think the question in the chat is kind of referring to. So I guess, like you say, that poem that you've not shown the kind of person who painted the house, would it matter that they read it and got something from it or not? Or is the fact that it exists as a poem outside of them, is that kind of more important, I guess? Or are they two different things?
I think they are two different things, but I think the mistake was telling him. What was I thinking? I could have. I don't regularly buys poetry. Well, I don't know actually. No, he probably does. But yeah, yeah. There's a number of questions there, aren't there? I mean, I think to go to the medical one, I mean, I'm imagining that, you know, the people are imagining there's an ethical issue there around listening to people. And I did ask for, I didn't actually record anyone. I spoke to people and then I would go away and write notes from memory, but I'd asked everyone's permission.
Yeah.
And what surprised me was that actually people were very happy, enthusiastic about using their actual verbatim words had I wanted to do that. Really generous and interested around that. So that problem I anticipated that didn't arise. But then the one that you never anticipate and always does arise is somebody either recognizes themselves or think they recognize themselves, which is often worse. So I think it's very rarely do I write about actual people. I think, you know, most of us find that when we once a character makes it into a poem, they're kind of transformed, I think. But it is a I mean, clearly my way of dealing with it is just to forget it happens and then deal with the aftermath when it happens. But it is, I think it's one of the necessary embarrassments of writing, isn't it? Otherwise we'd never write anything. I mean, somebody said this in a class today. We had this conversation about, you know, you have to write as though this isn't going to work in your case, but as though your dad is never going to read your poems. Like, so for a lot of us, it's like, you know, the worst person, the most to read it would be your dad or your gran or something like that. Maybe your partner, maybe, I don't know, but your child. But you have to override that, otherwise you're just going to be completely kind of stymied, aren't you?
That's it. And people self-censor too early in that sense, don't they, as you say, because they go, God, what would my dad think though? What would my mum think? What would so-and-so think? Before they've written it. And then it never gets written. And I think that, as you say, would be the worst thing.
It would. I think I've kind of, I've just got used to the fact sometimes it's just really embarrassing. But it is a question. And I think it's an important question when you're actually using other people's stories. I mean, that question that somebody was right to bring up.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all your really generous answers with us this evening, Tiffany. It's been so lovely to chat to you. And I just wonder, before we finish, if you want to read us another poem from the collection.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, and thank you so much. And thanks for your lovely. You've made me feel really good about it, which is really, you know, when a book comes out and you're just like, oh, and that's felt really nice. Shall I read Eggshell?
Yeah, I'll do. Yeah.
Because it's the last, so I've kind of read the first and the last book, and I've never read it before, and I've got to own this. So Otto the dog, actually, who is in it too. All right. Eggshell. Up the slowly gleaming conch of staircase, David inches, pot and brushes at the threshold. Who will keep the dog at bay? I'm cross-legged in the bedroom with my laptop saying, Otto, lie down. Door frames are a careful one. The brush flicks. David's mouth is soft and opens slightly like a creature surfacing. I'm working also for the rest to fall away. Oh, luxury, to pay a man for hands that would be sound in any kind of dark and not be always spoiling. Oh, my deadline. Otto snores, his beveled bronze head heavy on embroidery. How full of air, the song bag of each body's quiet business, barely lit, a screensaver for Mir. Nothing else. The radio downstairs. A woman's voice tugs back and forth. Disaster! Breaking on the stairwell. Breathe we on. So putting down no weight at all. Earth's curve inside. Between.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thanks so much again for joining us. And Tiffany Atkinson's Lumen is out now with Blood Axe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you soon.
Yeah, I hope so. In real life.
In real life, hopefully.
I hope.
Fantastic. So I'll just find a way to say goodbye now to Tiffany. Or Tiffany, if you could say bye to us yourself. I never know how to remove people. That's my only downfall with technology.
Also, here goes.
Fantastic. So thanks so much to Tiffany. And we're going to carry straight on now. And I'm going to bring in the wonderful Holly Pester, whose first collection, Comic Timing, is published by Granta Books. And so again, by the miracles of technology, I will now invite Holly to join us. Hello.
Hey, hello there. Hi.
It's good to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's good to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Oh, good. Okay. Your voice has just gone. It was lovely and clear when I was watching you and Tiffany, and now it's just gone quiet. But I guess that's just my problem.
Okay, I can try and I'll hold my mic a bit further up if
No,
that
it's
helps. Okay.
I think I can increase my voice. There we go.
Fantastic. There we go. So again, there's so much that I want to ask you about just this astonishing collection, but I wonder, before we get into it, if you want to read us a poem from it.
I do. And I just introduced my dog, who is eating trash on the sofa, which is
excellent.
Likes to visit, collect something, fish finger box, and then she'll go back and get something else and do that all evening, and then it'll be my job to pick it all up. I thought I'd poem called Dip, and it is about dip. I thought I'd try and theme my reading. I read all the sloppy ones. Just all over that. I thought that was just the sort of mood we might be in. What were we raised on? Smelly pink and orange dip. The dip is from class, from standing in a fridge glow looking, want nourishment to feel alive but punished. In the meantime, scoop your finger through 4 connected tubs, mass mixed, dumb resin, a turn, one of potency, a tangy, insincere blob, constantly hungry. Doesn't she feed you? There's a stiff in the door, knocking for draft, for a suck, a soft cry, a babe in the base, budget dips, down then up, once angry, twice hungry, 3 to 4 for a petite movement of consciousness. Oil the statement abnormal, I need money to live, then stick something in it. The decadent real. If you plaster your brags, well, you don't have to baroque yourself.
Fantastic. Not at all. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And before I get into the kind of nitty gritty of the questions that I wanted to ask, this is a debut collection, and I know that you've worked across kind of installation and sound and poetry, and made works for radio as well. And I just wondered what it was like to pull this collection together and have it out in the world, and what that process had felt like.
It was funny to sort of sit down and do a collection, not just a book, but a collection of poetry. I've done books before, and before that, most of my poetry life has existed in quite kind of ephemeral ways, like installations and performance and radio, and like lots of and or doing like other kinds of writing, or sort of mixed, hybrid kinds of forms of writing for publication. So it felt about time that I did that I was like, do a poetry book, Holly. So you're grown up now, you can do this. But it was. I did have a collection of poetry once years ago, and I just never did anything with it. It was just like it just died. It was just a file full of Word documents that I never did anything with, and so I was like a little bit worried that would happen again, I guess. And I just won't do it again. Maybe I'll just build up to it. But luckily, Rachel Allen came into my life, and and there was no going back. So the process of from that point of working with her, like from it turning into this sort of slightly angst-ridden bundle of documents, and conceiving of it is like she's now got an oat milk carton. I just like
quite right.
Finger box. From telling a book and a collection of poetry and things. And I really wanted to work with someone that really understood the conception, hold the poem, and again feel like a sort of performance. Work with the idea of liveness, and it couldn't have worked with someone better who kind of to sort of understand and help me through that.
Well, I think that, I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you later on that you've, because you mentioned that idea of performance, is that, and you talk about in the PBS magazine as well, one of the decisions about the book is to have it in these 4 kind of acts. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about kind of that, or that decision over the structure that you took.
Funny, at one point I wanted to call the book Acts, and then I phoned a friend and I was like, I've got an idea for the title. I'm going to call it Acts. And she went, Axe. I was like, no, Axe. No, Axe. Okay, forget it. Goodbye. And I just knew that there was a kind of quality to that word, and the sort of the resonances with stages of the text, and kind of biblical sense, but also in terms of the Greek ancient theatre of like the sort of staging process of drama in a narrative. I kind of wanted to kind of play with the almost like the consequentiality of what's comic and what's tragic, and just seeing if we could kind of play with that in terms of how we laid out the poems next to each other. And I think by like actually just, well, why don't we just come out and say it? Why do we be subtle about this? Why don't we just come out and say it? And also like have each act kind of signalled by a poem that became a sort of parabasis, like this kind of like speaking out to the audience, like coming out of the play. And like maybe like thinking about the mood of each act as well helped us sort of organise the book.
I think that word consequentiality, I think, is so interesting. I mean, the second poem in the collection begins with the line, stories like starting points. And I wondered how much of what you were doing was about wanting to resist kind of conventions of poetic narrative and structures within the collection. Or then on the other side of that, there's something like comic timing, the kind of titular poem of the book, that's paying kind of attention to everything, the kind of minutiae of everything. So almost kind of deepening a sense of narrative by saying, no, everything matters around the kind of central driving force of that poem. So I just wondered, kind of, for you, the idea of kind of resisting those conventions maybe of narrative, both, I guess, within single poems, but then, as you're saying there, across a collection as a whole as well.
Yeah, I think this idea about timing, like really important. The idea of timing as how a joke operates, but also timing as a sort of methodology for composition in a poem. Like I think kind of quite often operates in a way to a joke, but also how that is a kind of analogue of life or history. Like, I'm really interested in feeling the way that where a poem's line breaks or where a voice breaks, kind of analogues where a life or a body collapses, or where a kind of moment in history where there's a sort of rupture, explosion, catharsis, sublimation, all these kind of temporalities that kind of might occur, and it's line of poetry in a single act of speech or in a single kind of lifetime. So finding those kind of analogies in the sort of in feelings of time, in the kind of operation of time.
I think that notion of timing is so interesting, and I really wanted to ask about that, because I think in an early poem like Calling Sick, or later on a poem like It Was a Hot Patio too, there's the line breaks or the choices of the line length, and as you say, the timing of where that line breaks or how long that line should be. It's just such an astonishing thing that you've managed to achieve in this book. And does that come from, like, is it as one's writing it, as you're drafting it, is that coming from kind of reading it out loud, or do they just kind of flow out that way? Or is it like, where does that notion of kind of timing enter the space of the poem for you, I guess? Kind of, is it after that first draft, or is it as it's kind of coming out onto the page?
I wonder. I can guess, or I can wonder what happens. I think I'm always reading and writing with a sort of sense of a kind of liveness. That's how I learned to write poetry, was through a live event. It's just a bag now, it's just a bread. So there's this kind of imaginary public, well, not so imaginary public in every sort of poem. And every word has a sort of like kind of public and a kind of sociality that I've been sort of provoking or evoking. So I think when I write, I'm kind of half imagining that it as voice, as, and also feeling the almost kind of tussle of script and writing, that they can't really exist at once, but trying to make them exist at once, or my habit of trying to make them exist at once, is kind of where decisions, even though sometimes they don't feel like decisions, they feel like reactions, or kind of trying to, almost like the poem trying to survive. It's like it tries to survive by swerving and breaking, and trying to sort of not run out of energy or something. So I think if it's anything, it's like the imagined kind of public voice, and then this kind of the disturbance of script and text and
I love that idea of that. You just described that so well, that disturbance of the kind of script onto the page. And I guess to kind of carry on from thinking about that, in a poem like Shipbuilding, there's this astonishing opening and then into the kind of licking of stamps. And so also the kind of joy, as people will know in this collection, one of the kind of astonishing things is the way that these images kind of ping off each other, or the poems, as you're saying, this kind of, that kind of, these images or these ideas butt up against each other, the lines break, and they're kind of forced up against each other. And I guess I was thinking with some of these poems, and again, this is a hard question to maybe find an answer to, so don't worry, but it might only make sense in my own head. Do they come for you, we're talking about there, the kind of voice, the public voice of them and the script of them, but for you, when you're putting together these poems, do you find them in the image first, or is it in a location, or is it a concept, like an idea of something? Even like that first poem you read us today, like kind of, can you think, can you conjure back to kind of when you're writing it, kind of, do they begin with the language or with the image or with the idea that then you pursue with the voice of the poem, as it were?
Shipbuilding is a good example, because shipbuilding was into words that in the middle of the word had a and so I just found loads of words that had a P and a B in the middle of the word, like hip bone and shop boy and pitbull and hunchback. No, it's hunchback. There was another book that I couldn't and it's like I was really fascinated there, like just that was just a sort of interest on a sort of phonetic level, or kind of interested in the sort of fallibility of enunciation, as well as but then it was really interested in bringing those together and thinking about interests that just kind of I can't really kind of shake off, about kind of labour and exhaustion, or being kind of like living within the inevitability of work kind of following you through your body and through your day. So I liked the sort of parallel of those, but and also the history of the kind of the wordship building and the wonderful kind of protest song, and just thinking like, yeah, I guess the almost like in the way that a dream collapses signification and indexical meaning, iconic meaning, felt meaning, associative meaning, kind of collapses them all together. I kind of like how a poem can do that as well. So you've got all these words together, you've got all these images, and you've got associations, but you've also just got the very reality of the words, just kind of, like you say, just kind of bouncing off each other. Experiential. There's just levels of experience you can kind of mold it. That's why I love working with poetry, and how I find prose, even though I try harder, because if you write in prose and you write he's got a hat on, it's got to mean that there's someone with a hat. In poetry, that can mean like I just needed the shade of that sound hat. I just needed a consonant. I just needed something to make my voice or my articulators do that, because I want them to stop it. And you're working in a kind of very different, you don't need, in a kind of Gertrude Stein way, it doesn't need to mean hat. It doesn't need to mean that kind of figurative, literal kind of description. It can kind of be something else. So yeah. That's your question.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic, and I'm really glad that you mentioned those notions of the kind of labour and of work and of the body as well, because one of the other themes, I guess, that I was really interested in this book is, it seemed to me, expectations of people on us or our bodies as well, and so in a kind of macro sense of kind of labour and an economy, but also there's the poem that begins with a mentor requesting something of the kind of speaker of the poem, or the Uber driver, again in comic timing, these notions of expectations that are put on the body, I guess, or on the self somehow.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and I think and where that kind of pressure on the body, I don't know, represented linguistically or like critiqued, provoked linguistically. I would like to play with my. I was for my PhD, I was very interested in work songs, and which are quite trendy now, but.
You started it, yeah.
Oh, maybe someone found my PhD on the repository. And that turned into a project on lullabies, actually, which was a kind of twist on work song as a kind of anti-work song. But I was really interested in what Prynne calls these kind of sound words in work songs, and he was talking about Wordsworth's The Reaper. But I was just really interested in the relationship between work songs and sound poetry, where a sound in a song has to kind of hold body and it has to hold collective effort, and hold the economy and the history of that, as well as like literally kind of cohering an organism of labour. So yeah, I think that thinking is maybe still sort of residually in the poetics, that kind of feeling of where this is a strange tangent, but as I was obsessed with this is going back to my PhD as well, which is a really long time ago, but I was really interested. I asked if I could go and watch an episode of The Archers being recorded, because I don't know, I think they put child fan, and I just turned up and was like, no, I'm just really interested in how you make the gate noise and what. And it was really cool. They have this thing in the script that they call an effort noise. So it's when one of the people pretending to be a farmer has to pretend to be doing some really hard work and has to like pick up a lamb or something. I don't know what farmers do. Pick up lambs, and but obviously they're not. They're just stood at a microphone like together, and they have to kind of do this noise. Hilarious. And so I spent a really long time writing and thinking about this effort noise that these actors were doing in these studios, and now I can't hear. I still kind of listen to it sometimes, and now I just hear them and go. It's just in the script, effort noise. And so yeah, I've lost my thread completely.
That's all right. I mean, shortly, I want to ask you to read another question from the another poem, pardon me, from the collection. But there's just one question from the audience that I wanted to ask Holly, which is often quite a difficult one to answer. But just which poets or poetry collections have inspired you? I guess either broadly or you feel might have kind of fed into comic timing.
Oh no, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that I'll know exactly how to answer almost as soon as this is over. But the books that I was carrying around a lot one was called Work and Day by Bernadette Mayer, who's a kind of extraordinary poet and it's a kind of late Bernadette Mayer, and she talks a lot about labour and rent, which are kind of very interesting to me. And there's a book with the title that I haven't been able to get right, and I really meant to check it recently and look at my bookcase, but I've forgotten, so I'll make a mess of it again. It's by Karen Brodeen, and it's called something like A Woman Sat at Her Desk Thinking, or A Woman Computer Thinking. It's really if only I could remember what it was called. But yeah, I think there's a pattern in they seem to be like women writers who are kind of coming from maybe a kind of outsider. Hannah Wiener is also quite influential. Who's a kind of wonderful writer. She did lots of very kind of strange experiments on herself I have a kind of love in the book. I guess it's kind of women poets kind of reproductivity and the relationship and capital and working and living within capital, living as a sort of struggle, making a living. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
Great. And of course, you've got some, but you've written some in the bulletin as well, into the magazine, some books that you like as well. So that's great. And it's been so wonderful to chat to you, Holly. And I just wonder if you can finish us off with another poem from this magnificent book.
Yeah, so I've found another sloppy one for you.
Fantastic.
This one's about porridge. From dip to porridge, which just felt right. This one's called How Why to Make Porridge, and she's fallen asleep in the yogurt glass, destroyed, and she's exhausted. How and why to make porridge? Because you like to venture beyond without moving, and grains bloat in milk. Porridge is a real meal, ancient and coming, composed like courage in a long, rough minute of nettles and chamomile seeds, Yorkshire fog seed, knotweed, hensick, buckwheat, spit, clag, store, mumps, spike dumplings, herbs spiked. Then the worst soldier had my foot, halted, said, "Hey, martyr, hey, suckling keep, for all the time spent softening your full, forthcoming your funk." I said, "I'm heavy, sauce, myth bulked. True, I am cope pod, definitely a shape lying on soap, hoping for mercy or myrtle for a truant to turn out the future, fully preserved and unworrying hot cupboard. But oh no, I am turning into someone's artisanal idea. I am for the farm shop, expensive, was bled, relaxed, and led to a pit, a blindfold braided into my hair, drawn and packed down, belly taped, drawer swapped for an older, masculine shoulder joint, still and sensitive for centuries since I am on the telephone, waiting for the opening times to your museum.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Holly. It's such a wonderful poem. Oh no, I am turning into someone's artisanal idea. That's our worst nightmare, isn't it? It's all of our worst fears. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening, Holly. It's just such an astonishing book that I think has kind of moved forward for me what I think is possible in poetry. So I'm just really thrilled to have been able to talk to you about it. It's been a real honour. So thank you very much to Holly and to Tiffany for joining us as well, and to everybody for turning out tonight. Do check out the Poetry Book Society, and look out for both Tiffany's and Holly's books wherever you buy your books. See you soon.